Welcome to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to the OHBM Neurosalience podcast. I'm your host, Peter Bannazzini. Today, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Charlotte Grosse Wiesmann, a cognitive neuroscientist whose work is transforming our understanding of how the human social brain emerges. Charlotte is a professor at the University of Technology in Nuremberg and director of the research group on social brain development at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig, Germany. Her research brings together developmental psychology, advanced neuroimaging, and computational modeling to trace the neural foundations of social cognition from early infancy to early childhood. By studying how infants and toddlers begin to infer beliefs, intentions, and mental states in others, Charlotte is shedding light on the origins of theory of mind and on the brain circuits that make it possible. Charlotte began her academic training in physics at the University of Göttingen. She transitioned into cognitive science and neuroscience during her graduate studies at Leipzig University, and in 2016 earned her PhD through the International Max Planck Research School, working closely with MPI in Leipzig. Her PhD research showed that false belief understanding in toddlers is accompanied by specific measurable neural signatures. One of her landmark contributions has been identifying how the maturation of white matter tracts, particularly the dorsal and ventral pathways linking temporal and prefrontal regions, predicts infants' emerging ability to attribute mental states to others. Using diffusion-weighted imaging in very young children, her team showed that structural connectivity in these tracts correlates with behavioral markers of social cognition. Her later work has further elucidated two separate networks of theory of mind: a mature verbal theory of mind network that emerges around 4 years, and a nonverbal theory of mind that comes earlier. In this episode, we talk through Charlotte's most significant findings and their implications. And whether you're interested in connectomics, developmental theory, functional imaging methods, or the future of neuroimaging, this is a rich, insightful, and really fun conversation at the intersection of neuroscience, imaging methods, and human development. So I hope you enjoyed it. I really had fun. Okay, I have the honor of interviewing Charlotte Grosse Wiesmann, who has been doing a lot of amazing research with looking at development, child development, using measures such as DTI and MRI and other measures to equate brain structure with behavioral milestones. And Charlotte, so you have two positions right now. One is at the University of Technology in Nuremberg, which you just started as a professor, and you still have your group at the Max Planck Institute. And that's where I first met you several years ago when I visited the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. And so let's just get started then.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you so much also for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, well, thanks. Thanks for coming on. And I know that there were a few schedule delays, but we're finally doing it now. And I had a great time looking into your research as well. So just to begin, I mean, I think the first thing that kind of resonated with me when I was looking at your CV and everything is that you have a physics background, because I also got my undergraduate physics. I didn't go quite as far as you. You actually started pursuing a master's in quantum gravity, and then you decided to shift to cognitive neuroscience. So what happened there? What was your mindset going into physics, and then what caused you to shift directions?
So I was really interested in I guess that's most of the people studying physics, or many of the people studying physics. I was really interested in the fundamental laws of nature when I finished high school and wanted to understand what's happening in the world, what holds the world together. And so that was the motivation for studying physics. And that's also why in my master, then I went into the direction of first string theory, actually, trying to understand or trying to find answers for how to describe the world in terms of fundamental laws. So that's what I did in my master thesis. And then I actually even started a PhD in quantum gravity. But then basically, the very beginning of the PhD, I already realized that, or maybe already I had a hint of that during my master's, but I didn't quite admit it to myself. Maybe the kind of work in particular wasn't quite for me. So basically in that field of theoretical mathematical physics, it's quite lonely, the work you're doing. I was very much on my own working with paper and pencil, actually, not even a computer.
Oh, wow.
Like
Oh,
calculating integrals and
oh my God.
yeah. And I think in the beginning of my PhD, I had an office on my own also because the group was just building up. It was a new group working on quantum gravity in two dimensions, like two space dimensions and one
Okay.
time dimension, because that's a case where you can solve some problems more easily, especially bringing quantum theory together with gravity, theory of gravity. And so I was sitting there in a big tower in Hamburg, like a big skyscraper in my office on my own in
Oh
the
my
evening, trying to solve some problem. And then I just felt, well, the world isn't two-dimensional, is it? And and I felt quite lonely also, just in the way of working, that there was relatively little exchange. I mean, of course, we were discussing things, but it's quite hard in that field, at least at the PhD level, to really engage in deep conversations about your work, because the work is so technical and detailed that basically you have to do the work yourself, like work it out yourself. Mathematically. And I was really missing that kind of developing ideas together and working on problems together and being able to exchange together, and also talking just with people not from the field and explaining to them in like more detail what I was doing. And
Yeah.
having conversations about that at a deeper level and not just at this superficial level of, I'm working about trying to unify quantum theory and gravity in two dimensions.
Oh
And
my God.
so that's why I then decided to leave the field.
Okay. Okay.
And I actually took a little bit of time to decide what I would do next. So it wasn't that I had the realization, okay, it's neuroscience, but
Yeah.
I had to think a little bit about it. And I had been curious about the human mind all the time already, as much as I had been curious about the fundamental laws of nature. So it wasn't that far of a step to go in that direction. And what I actually did is I went to the library a lot and read up on different topics, especially concerning the human mind and philosophy of mind, and also studied philosophy alongside my physics studies.
Yep.
And then, the topics of self-awareness and also theory of mind, understanding other people's minds,
Yeah.
really caught my interest. And then I started contacting people whether they would be interested in supervising me in a
Oh,
PhD in that field with my physics background.
okay. And then you came along. I guess Angela Federici was a key person with bringing you in, I guess, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wrote an email, a relatively short email actually, to uh, Angela Federici, suggesting just writing my interests and asking whether she would be interested in supervising a PhD. And I was actually really amazed. She invited me and took time to show me the institute and talk with me for, I think I was there for several hours. And then she offered me to come to start for half a year in order to see whether this is really my topic. I think she realized, okay, there's someone who's really interested and has potential, but she first has to find out what she really wants. And I
Yeah.
guess she was right about that. But she gave me this possibility to develop a project within half a year. And so that was really amazing. And then she also really let me develop my own project and do something about a topic I was really excited about. So that was the start, basically.
That's awesome. And so I have a couple of questions related to all that. So it's interesting that you also mentioned philosophy. I think it almost seems like a canonical thing where you have a physics major who wants to really understand, deeply like to figure it all out, to sort of figure out the principles of why we're here and existence, and then it sort of naturally goes to philosophy, and it naturally goes to neuroscience in some sense. I mean, it seems like it's all about how we perceive the world, and but then how the world really is. And it seems that the science could be better if it were more like a group effort. I mean, it seems like if there were more interactions and more, it seems like it doesn't have to be intrinsic to the field in some sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's just my outsider perspective, I guess, because I mean, I only did a master thesis right in the end. So I'm sure that's different for people who've dived much deeper and have been doing that research for most of their lives. But to me, the feeling I got also with my fellow PhD students and some people I stayed in touch with who made it to postdoc domains is that basically the topic and the tools are so complex at this point that it's really hard to understand even what your fellow PhD student who's working on the same theory and the same bigger question, what they are actually working on. And that makes it so hard to exchange and also I felt like, to be creative, to really develop your own question and your own approach. So it really, you have to be in the field for such a long time until you can actually drive questions and develop ideas yourself.
Yeah.
And I have the feeling that that's maybe also one of the problems of the field, that at that point you lack the distance for having new ideas because you've been in the field for so long before you can actually develop ideas. But of course, it's my outsider perspective.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It might be a function of the field. I mean, neuroscience is old, but sort of like the modern neuroscience approach is relatively new. And we're still kind of like, I think we're all like kids in candy stores. We're like, we have these tools and we're like finding new things immediately all over the place and just thinking of new questions together. And it seems like maybe, who knows, maybe brain imaging in 100 years will be kind of like, theoretical physics, and will be like, very much like, okay, this is, we have this huge learning curve and it's like very siloed, but maybe not. Who knows? And that's interesting. I always feel good about, if I'm hiring people in my group, if they have a physics or a background. One thing good about physics, and actually I'll ask you about this, is how it's maybe shaped how you ask questions in your field, is that I feel it sort of grounds you in asking maybe slightly more pointed, deep questions like, okay, I really want to figure out the mechanism of how this works. I don't just want to say, oh, this place is active or whatever. I want to understand what's going on. And I think physicists more naturally think along those lines, where they're not, an explanation is actually more deeply mechanistic rather than just simply descriptive. And I think neuroscience, needs that more. So you started at Max Planck, and right away you decided to look at child development. So when you started forming your questions, and you mentioned that Angela allowed you to form your own work. And so basically, I'm guessing you sort of, saw what was available, sort of read up on the field, and sort of said, oh, this is something that's like a gap in the field or something that I'll delve into.
Yeah, I mean, that was really, really amazing opportunity. I mean, she does mostly language development, language research, but she was also interested in theory of mind in the sense of that there are certain structural potential similarities. And it was just, I found that really great opportunity that I could just, coming from a completely different field, to get that trust to be allowed to develop my own question in a field that I just brought in, basically, and to give me that freedom to just sit there also for like a year, basically, to develop questions and ideas and so on. Start just my whole own project.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And that's actually one thing nice about, I think, the Max Planck and a little bit like the NIH is where there's a little bit less pressure to be plugged into a project that is tied with a grant. It's like you're funded and there's a little bit more room to sort of explore. Yeah. So when I heard your talk about a year and a half ago, I believe it was there were some aspects to it, but I do remember your first paper. I think that really made a big impact. White matter maturation is associated with the emergence of theory of mind in early childhood. And that was in Nature Communications in 2017. And do you want to maybe describe a little bit your paper, and then we can go into maybe talking about that and other ones too. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so what we did there, that was basically my part of my PhD work. So there's this in cognitive development, there's basically this breakthrough around 4 years approximately, where children all of a sudden start, or it looks like all of a sudden they're starting to understand that other people can have different views or different beliefs on the world um, than the kids themselves. And that's pretty consistent across all kind of different tasks. That's when children start to understand, oh wow, okay, someone can think something else than I do. So I was very curious what drives this breakthrough, and there are lots of theories about that, of course. So cognitive theories about what drives this breakthrough. And so what I thought is, didn't anyone look at this in the brain, and maybe the brain can give us information about what's happening there? There must be some brain correlates of this big change. And so what I did is, at that point, we weren't able to do functional MRI yet in young children. I mean, now we're advancing on that. But I also thought, I mean, that was one aspect of it. And the other thing I thought was, okay, but there also have to be there should be some structures changing in the brain if there's such a fundamental change in abilities. And I would be curious what that is.
Yes.
And so what we did is we acquired different kind of structural brain sequences. So we did diffusion MRI, but also anatomical sequences.
Yep.
And so the first thing I looked at, I was fascinated by fiber connections and the ability to reconstruct those. And there was also quite a bit of work on that in language development in Angela Federizi's department and some experts in diffusion MRI. So I took the chance and looked at the diffusion MRI measures first and reconstructed fiber tracts and looked at how they would be related with this breakthrough.
Yeah.
And what we found then was basically surprisingly for us, it wasn't something that we had predicted. And so what we found is that the maturation or maturational indices, I should say, of the arcuate fascicle, which is also very important in language. And that's something that we hadn't predicted, although I was working in a language department, that was basically the core tract related to the theory of mind breakthrough over above all kind of other abilities. So we also assessed language abilities, executive function abilities, general intelligence, and so on.
Okay. And so I have never questions about that. I mean, a lot of people have been doing theory of mind research, and they point to various areas. I always thought, I mean, from way back, there's some work claiming it was like purely prefrontal cortex, but they're only studying adults, and they're like finding the areas that are most active with a theory of mind task. And now we'll go into to me, the hardest part, I think, is, at least from my perspective, is designing the right paradigm that pulls this out in children and differentiates. But still, I think that was also amazing that you brought that in. But as far as the diffusion imaging, so I did have one question. You used, at least in this paper, you used both fiber track and fractional anisotropy measures to assess like how basically the arcuate fasciculus is unconnected and then it becomes connected, I guess, in some sense. And that's the whole area associated with language. But you determined that through both of those measures. Is there any, like, is one better than the other, or is the information unique in some sense or complementary?
Yeah. They're definitely complementary measures. So fractional anisotropy or also other diffusion tensor metrics are basically local indices, microstructural organization. We can capture like tissue organization. Also, they're also, affected by things like crossing fibers in a local area. So they capture basically microstructural local change in the white matter. I really thought or that was also a discussion we had in the department, of course, that fiber tracts, they are about connectivity, right? It's not a local measure, but it's really about connecting different regions. So the discussion we had was like, how can we get more to measures that reflect this more global sense of that a tract connects to regions. And that's how we got to streamline density, looking at, okay, can we characterize connectivity from one region to another? along the tract rather than just microstructural change.
And so if I understand it right, so at age 4, so the kids perform this task much better. It's almost like, the fiber tracks, I imagine it takes some time for them to connect. And like if they're half connected, I mean, it seems like a discrete thing, but it seems like there's a time period where there's a continuous sort of like, growing a connection. Is that potentially captured in the success rate of doing this task, or do they sometimes get it and sometimes don't at this interface?
Yeah. So the fiber tracks definitely are, of course, not a 1 or 0 thing, but they mature over time. Yeah, there are also studies showing that there is an arched fascicle in neonates as well, right? And that then matures. So it
Okay.
matures more and more. And of course, most of the cognitive measures are also more continuous for the theory of mind tasks that we're using. I mean, of course, there is a continuous development of social cognition and also of precursors of this ability. So it's basically a specific ability to understand that other people can have different beliefs from our own, which we measure with something called the false belief test. So understand that other people can have false belief.
Yes.
And this is something that actually changes quite consistently and relatively suddenly from one time point to another. There's, of course, an inter-individual variance on when that time point is, but typically when kids get one of these tasks, they start getting all kind of different other tasks as well. So in that sense, where it's about false beliefs in all kind of different shapes.
Okay.
So in that sense, that's relatively, that's also why I've used the term breakthrough, relatively sudden change. And an interesting thing actually that I've looked into more recently is that at the same time, there's also relatively sudden change in other domains of reasoning that is related to understanding other people's beliefs, not only social cognition, but also in reasoning about other problems that have similar logical structure, I would say.
Yeah, I was reading, what your more recent research is, like holding alternate views of reality in your mind. It's not just a social thing. I think for the audience, just to talk a little bit about what the theory of mind, like a typical paradigm for theory of mind, or even a paradigm for the false belief. I thought it's very elegant. It's worth maybe describing maybe what that.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, maybe as a background, why this task is considered to be so important to measure whether someone can actually reason about other people's minds is that if we have the same belief about the world and I infer your belief and predict your actions, we can never really know whether I used my own belief in order to infer your belief and predict your actions, or whether I actually understood that it's really yours or not. And that's why it's so important to look at a situation where we have different views and different beliefs. Beliefs are an interesting case in addition to, for example, something like visual perspective, where our visual perspective can also differ, right? But the visual perspective is grounded in the real world. So that's really my representation of the world. You just see it from a different angle. Whereas if we're talking about beliefs, it's actually something that can be false. So it can be false representation of the world. So if I'm really fully able to represent the mind of other people, I need to be able to also represent if they have a view of the world that is not consistent with my view of the world. And that's why the false belief task is considered to be so important. And like a typical task, for example, so we make that, of course, into a story that works for 3 or 4-year-old children. So, for example, you have an object that is hidden in a basket. So there's a so-called Sally and Ann task. Sally and Ann are 2 kids playing with a doll. The doll is put in a basket. Then Sally leaves the scene. And in the meantime, Ann moves the doll from the basket into a box. And then Sally comes back and the kids are asked, where will Sally search for her doll? Of course, she left it in the basket, so she should be searching in the basket. We know that as adults.
Yep.
But 3-year-olds pretty consistently answer in the box. So where the doll now really is. And they don't seem to understand that she didn't see that. And that's why she doesn't know. And that's just one story. And you can do the same kind of story, for example, with a container that contains something different from what you would think. Like, for example, a Smarties tube that contains pencils. And then you ask the kids, what would someone else think is in there? And if they know that there are pencils in there, they would say pencils instead of Smarties, and don't seem to understand that someone can have a false belief about the world.
That's so interesting. So it's sort of like you're modeling what they know in some sense. You're trying to, and that's right. And it is completely fundamental to any sort of social interaction that you need to be able to do that well. And that's interesting that the 3-year-olds, I mean, it's such a nice task that the 3-year-olds can't do this, and 4-year-olds and upwards can, and it's so natural to do that. And it reminded me, it's funny because as I was reading this, I was thinking, okay, this is, and it's a tangent a little bit, but it seems all related. Reading this book by Michael Graziano on consciousness, and he has this theory of consciousness, which is just an attention schema. It's basically we have to model, just like we're modeling, like in this case, we're modeling other people's attention, but more than that, but their attention, like how they see the world. And it's useful. And so, but it's also you need to model your own attention to understand how that differs. And his theory is that it's just consciousness, so-called, is basically just explained by our own model of our attention schema in some sense. And it seems like this is sort of fundamental to that in some way.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting theory. I mean, like with the attention models. So I think this a little bit more complex way, so the false belief understanding, this complex way of reasoning about other people's mental states in a very flexible way, I would argue goes beyond attention.
Okay.
But we have some research with infants, with younger children and infants, and even also going into adulthood, where we see that there might be also faster ways of reasoning about others. And that there you actually really very much seems to be driven by understanding other people's attention, and that other people's attention highlights what we pay attention to and what we remember and highlight in our own mind, and that allows us to predict what other people are doing. And so that seems to be kind of a shortcut to understanding others in social cognition. And so we're doing some more research on that, but it might be that that's actually what we're mostly doing, and that we're not doing so much of this complex inference path, but that we're really using those maybe attentional schemas to model more how other people, or to predict how other people might behave.
Well, that's interesting. So so that's related to, you had this other paper on the 2 ways of the implicit versus explicit theory of mind method. So maybe we should just mention briefly, so that you have the white matter track that's becoming connected, but what is it connecting to? What are the primary areas that seem like they're mostly involved?
So for the white matter tracks that we saw for the basically for the standard false belief task there that I described, I mean, that's in particular the archiphysical, connecting inferior frontal brain regions with posterior temporal brain regions. And now the TPJ is really kind of a core region reported for theory of mind, activated for theory of mind in adults and older children.
Yep.
And also found now for children of that age, 3 to 4-year-olds. And the inferior frontal gyrus and the archiphysical both are important in language and understanding structure, potentially more generally. So what we made out of that is that we thought this could be relating, understanding others, and handling different mental representations with basically structuring them and understanding which one is actually my representation of the world and which one is what I would call a meta representation. So a representation that someone else has about the world, or that I can reason about independently of the actual world representation.
Okay. And then where does the precuneus come in, or the posterior cingulate cortex? I mean, that's sort of like more, that's part of the default mode network, actually. It's sort of like a sense of self. Maybe that's involved with sort of like, a self comparison in some sense.
Yeah. Basically, theory of mind activates a network that is basically a subnetwork of the default network. And so it's also the precuneus and the medial prefrontal cortex. And I would say it's really an open question what the different regions in the network are doing. There's a lot of discussion and suggestions about it and opinions. I think actually that's one of the big exciting questions that we still have in theory of mind domain, and that really requires other kinds of tasks to target other kinds of tasks, and also other kinds of methods potentially to be more specific and not just look at the group level big region analysis, but really go on the individual level and on the pattern of activation multivariate level to see more what do these regions actually represent in terms of contents when I reason about other people's minds, and how do the regions interact? How are these contents exchanged and transformed between the networks? So I think that's really an exciting question. And I think there again, children can really tell us a lot because there's a lot changing in that age. So that's where we can really see a difference between how is it when we're able to understand other people's mental representations as independent of our own representation of the world, and
Yes.
how is it when we can't do that yet? And that might give us some answers about what the function of these different regions in the network are.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize how really powerful that approach is. I mean, the alternative that people try to do in different contexts is look at patients who have lesions in those areas and see how their behavioral deficits manifest, or try to use TMS to knock out the regions. But here, it's really elegant. You can just simply look at a child as as these abilities are coming online and seeing what the neural correlates of the regions, the connectivity and the activity, how those correlate with what is coming online. It's such a nice way of understanding, not just children, but it's just broad impacts, implications about how the brain is organized. So I think that's really a nice approach as far as that's concerned. I'm surprised
Thank
more
you.
people aren't doing it. I mean, I think that maybe they are. Maybe I just don't know about it. So I had a question regarding that, though. So there are deficits that children have sometimes if they have autism, or later in life if you have schizophrenia or whatever, but there are developmental differences. So could you describe maybe what you know as far as how children who have Asperger's or autism manifest in terms of this structural development?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of deficits related to the spectrum disorder, right? Autism spectrum disorder. Specifically, social cognitive abilities and social communicative abilities are strongly impacted, and also, in particular, theory of mind. And on the other hand, there are also alterations in the white matter and long range fiber tracts, in particular, in autism. And those are actually pretty broad, so they're not specifically only related to the archive vesicle, for example, but there are studies showing that impairments of the archive vesicle in autism are related to impairments in language and social cognition. So
Okay.
it might be that these impairments in the archive vesicle actually mediate the social communicative impairments observed in autism.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So that's interesting in itself. But let's say you have normal children. Is there like a range? Like, for instance, are there some late developers and early developers? And is there a difference that's manifest later in life if someone develops a little bit later? Let's say they develop theory of mind and this structure develops maybe at age 5 as opposed to age 4. Do they catch up? I mean, do they is it a bad thing if they develop late?
Yeah. Yeah. So there definitely is a range. I mean, there are some kids who pass the false belief. There are quite few, but some kids who pass the false belief task at early 3, and others only when they're 5. So that's also quite typical. Like around 4, there are about half of the kids who pass and the others don't. So there definitely is a range, and there are individual differences. And in typical development, it's not that those who pass the task late or later worsen understanding others or social cognition. They do catch up. So there's just this natural range. Of course, if you look at clinical populations, then they are you typically also see later deficits in social cognition. So in autism, of course, for example, that's the case.
Yes. Yeah. So okay. Okay. It's interesting. So it seems like you're associated with some working on ways of environmental enrichment or stimulation, or I mean, not really, like just sort of maybe fostering this development through environmental. So do you think that it's a intrinsically programmed structure, or is the structure somewhat interactive with the environment as far as the development is concerned? It's like
Yeah.
the specific kid is in a really enriched environment, lots of social interactions. This structure develops faster or better.
Yeah. No, I think it's definitely an interaction. So, I mean, the results that we reported there, they're associations, right? So we can't say in what direction it goes. And there are also studies showing that you can train, right? Like if you train certain cognitive abilities, the white matter matures or develops. So I definitely think that it's an interaction that goes in both directions. So I think it's something that is, in typical development, the archetypical is going to develop and theory of mind is going to develop. So in that sense, it's there. But of course, through fostering the development, there's an influence on when that happens. So for example, talking a lot about mental states. So talking with your kids about what someone else might believe or thinks or what they have on their mind causes that, or there are training studies showing that then those kids actually develop theory of mind abilities earlier. And also, for example, reading books together, which might be related, right? Because in books you have protagonists and you have to understand what the protagonists are thinking and doing.
Yes.
So, and book reading also correlates with earlier theory of mind or predicts earlier theory of mind on longitudinal studies.
That's interesting. I wonder how plastic it is, later in life. I think that, in today's world, it seems like a lot of people could benefit from more strengthening of theory of mind, understanding other people's views or beliefs or things like that. Is there any evidence of plasticity in that regard too?
So I'm not sure for theory of mind whether there are any training studies in adults, I have to admit, but definitely in other domains, right? So that would make me confident that that's something that you can still influence and train. But on the other hand, I do think that for something like social cognitive development or theory of mind, and the same also for language, that there are something like sensitive periods. So periods, in language, we know pretty well that if you learn a language like in your teenage time, you're not going to learn it to the same extent anymore than if you learn it as a little kid. And I find it quite plausible that it would be similar for a theory of mind, that there is a sensitive period where you have the biggest impact, and that later you can train it to a certain extent, but not as much anymore.
Okay.
I guess in lesion patients or stroke patients, there are interventions on social cognitive abilities. I don't know whether specifically about theory of mind, I'm not aware of that, but for social cognitive abilities, yes, and there are positive effects of interventions.
Okay. So just back to your paper, back to what you briefly started talking about. I wanted to go into that a little bit more. And you have another paper on, and I just happened to delve into this one, 2 systems for thinking about other thoughts in developing brain. So you mentioned that briefly. So there's potentially 2 mechanisms. One is more implicit, where that might come online earlier, and one comes online, at age 4, about with the connection of the arcuate fasciculate. So could you talk a little bit more about that? Do these 2 mechanisms function fundamentally differently? And as I was reading your paper, I thought, well, could it just be that it's this one mechanism that's working well implicitly, but then it just gets connected to the language network, and then therefore it's able to be explicit then, expressed or consciously, more manifest. So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, that was really very much an open question when we started that research, and I find your way of phrasing it was pretty intuitive to me at that point as well. What we then saw was that basically the implicit measures that we looked at were absolutely unrelated to the explicit measures that we were looking at, and were also associated with different and actually statistically independent brain regions and structures.
Isn't there one overlap? I thought there was some area that almost showed an overlap.
Yeah, so it wasn't directly overlapping in that original study we did, but we followed up with some other implicit measures also. And there actually is a region where we do see overlap between the 2, and even also in activation. So what I wanted to say, the overlap is actually something that we see in the precuneus.
Yes.
So that's quite interesting because, those are speculations what the precuneus is doing. But so one possibility or one suggestion that has been made for the precuneus also in other fields is that it might be kind of a relay region that kind of switches between more internal and external stimuli or representations, and also might be involved in self versus other processing. So those are things that might be important in both implicit and explicit measures of of social cognition. I actually, in the meantime, I'm not really talking about implicit theory of mind anymore, because I'm not so sure whether it's really a theory of someone's mind that
Right.
we have there, or rather something where we're guided by other people's attention, and that allows us to make pretty sophisticated predictions about how other people will act.
Interesting.
And to learn from others and interpret their behavior and their communication. But we might not, in that sense, be inferring and having a theory of their mental representation. But so for that, we also need to differentiate between what is the outside world, what is the other's view, or what is external, what is internal. Yeah, so that's why the precunious might be relevant for both processes.
Okay. It's different. It's a different paradigm than the explicit. I mean, how do you probe implicit theory of mind? I mean, what's a typical paradigm for that?
Yeah. So the paradigm that we use there in that paper that you referred to, the 2020 paper in PNAS. So I described this task with Sally and Anne right before, and there was the doll or the marble was hidden in a different place. And now instead of asking children, where will Sally search for her marble, we actually track their gaze. So we look at what do they predict non-verbally where Sally is going to search.
Oh,
I mean, you would think that should be the same, but surprisingly, it doesn't correlate at all with them answering the question verbally, and is associated with different brain regions.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. Okay.
And maybe I'm just going to add, because I think that brings us a little bit more to the mechanisms of this, that we have some neurotests. So what we observed is that kids and even adults, if they're not even asked what someone else is supposed to do, but they're asked a question about, for example, detecting an object. So just about their physical reasoning about their environment. And in that physical reasoning, they're influenced by if there's a bystander who's actually irrelevant to the task, they're influenced by what the bystander believes, where that object is or whether it's there or not. So for example, adults are faster at detecting a ball that is revealed behind a wall if someone else believes that the ball should be there, although they saw that the ball had left the scene.
Huh.
So that's a task of a colleague of mine, Agi Kovac. And we observe similar things and even more extreme in infants. So what we see there, going back to that Sally and Anne task, is that basically infants seem to expect the marble. So we do a paradigm where we just reveal the marble, and then they're surprised if the marble is where it's actually should be, and expect it to be where Sally believes the marble to be. So it seems like infants, they're actually really misremembering their environment according to how someone else views the environment, and that they seem to remember it the way that someone else has seen it last. So basically, when the other looked at it, the other's attention cued that place and made them remember the marble in this place, and that they don't really pay attention to the marble moving afterwards and just remember it where the other believes it to be. And that, of course, allows you to predict pretty well how others will act, because you just assume their false beliefs yourself, and then you can predict how they're going to act themselves.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's really interesting. So infants actually have this ability to understand what others' perspective. I mean, so sort of they lock onto that. They make an error in some sense. They lock onto what the other person, but then when their explicit theory of mind comes in, then they also can predict what the other person is going to do. So I'm trying to understand, when do they have the correct belief about where the marble is? I mean, or where the object is in the basket. So do they ever override that in any sort of way? I'm trying to get my head around doing the task correctly versus not doing it. Doing it correctly is theory of mind. Not doing it is not. But they still are doing it correctly. Is there any mismatch between, like, once it does come online? Have you ever tried to look at a mismatch between the two mechanisms in some sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of task allows us to look at, when do they actually do both correctly? When can they predict where Sally is going to search? And when can they predict where, like at the same time, also predict where the marble really is? And it seems like that these two different perspectives, that only comes around 4 years. So that's when kids can really understand, okay, someone else can have a belief that differs from my own, and I can reason about both of these beliefs or representations of the world and understand which one is whose belief. And it's not just that I'm like influenced by what's happening and what other people have cued for me and selected with their attention for me to remember
Yeah.
in order to predict others.
Okay. Okay. Well, this is really cool. So another totally tangential question. It seems like, so many animals are very social. The social is, sort of the name of the game for most survival. Obviously do, primates all the way down, like where does this, not necessarily the ability itself is but like these brain structures, are these similar to various primates or even other life forms?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in great apes, the structures are pretty similar. And there's actually, so there was a debate about whether great apes have an arcuate fascicle. A colleague of mine, actually also in the department of Angela Federici, he recently showed that there was an arcuate fascicle also in chimps, albeit less developed than the human one.
Okay.
But it's like an archiphysical that also goes really all the way. I mean, of course, it was known that there was like a similar track, but an archiphysical that also goes all the way from the medial temporal gyrus to the IFG. So
Okay.
it does seem that in great apes, the structure is there and that it had to mature more, evolve more in humans. That maybe that's related to the evolution of language and
Yes.
even more sophisticated social cognitive abilities. But for example, there are also animals with completely different brain structure that are also very advanced in social cognitive abilities. For example, birds.
Yes. I was thinking birds. Yeah.
So, for example, ravens perform really well on perspective-taking tasks and are able to process perspectives that differ from their own. I mean, whether they task a false belief task, that's debated. There is no clear study about that. But at least perspectives that differ and they can handle that. Yeah, so there seem to be other brain structures that also allow for sophisticated social cognition.
That's so interesting. Bird brains are, I mean, I'm just reading a little bit about that. I mean, they're fundamentally different in their structure, and nobody knows what is really happening in terms of how they can actually, like ravens, for instance, this tiny little brain has very similar cognitive functions as maybe a 2-year-old or something like that. Maybe, well, in this case, maybe 4-year-old or 5-year-old in that regard. Yeah, nobody knows. I mean, that's really, it's fascinating how maybe nature solved this problem in a different way. And that's actually leads to another question. So what are I guess the immediate question is sort of like, nobody really knows what's actually going on in these areas. I mean, you can describe the areas like, oh, this is important for this, and you can describe it as, self-other sort of comparison or a relay station. But like, I'm just wondering, it would be nice. I think the big gap in neuroscience that, will take the next 50 years or so to figure out is to connect the scales of like, what's happening in terms of neural firing. And is there a code that we can, what does a computation look like? uh, yeah, but that's
Yeah,
another question altogether. Right?
I mean, that's of course really big question. And I think ultimately what would be nice to do is to connect this really basic, fundamental question with the higher level of a complex phenomenon like social cognition or theory of mind. I think we're very far away from that, unfortunately. But I do think that that's the way we need to go to understand better what's happening. And I do think that there are fundamental principles, basically, of brain organization that allow for more complex phenomena or capacities, phenomena of intelligence to develop out of that or to have evolved out of that. But that's kind of this process to understand from the very basic to the more complex. I think is really difficult. But I do think that there are fields where there have been advances in that area, like for example in vision research, and I do take inspiration from those approaches. And ideally I would like to at some point understand social cognition more in terms of more basic computations.
Yeah, no, it's actually it's a wide open question. I mean, basically, you're laying the scaffolding, and that, like you said, it's fundamentally important to lay the scaffolding of what is important to what, and then you can draw all kinds of inferences from that, and then we slowly develop our models that try to bring all this information in to sort of understand mechanisms and try to simulate that in some regard. And that actually sort of brings me to my next question in terms of, there was one paper that I mean, it was sort of a commentary that you wrote on timing matters, disentangling the neurocognitive sequence of mentalizing. It wasn't your paper that you were writing about. I mean, it was a paper by Tan et al., which they're looking at ECOG, actually giving really interesting signatures. Basically, it was a measure looking at different frequencies associated with these tasks themselves. And what's the potential of that? I mean, so you had the good commentary that you were last author on in
Yeah.
TICS.
Yeah. So we discussed that paper in our journal club and my group, and we found it really intriguing and interesting, and that's why we wrote that commentary
Okay.
together. So basically, what the paper shows, so they're using ECOG, and that allows like on the one hand, very high local resolution, at the same time temporal resolution. And then what they see is basically a temporal progression in theory of mind tasks, a temporal progression from more posterior to anterior regions of the theory of mind network. So basically starting in visual brain regions and then moving on to the more posterior typical theory of mind regions, so regions of the specific subnetwork of the default network.
Yes.
And then finally activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. And we found that quite interesting because that was also in line with how we discussed about what these regions might be doing and in what sequence. So that basically first we process kind of a representation of the environment. So we make kind of a representation of the environment that in the visual regions, and we might even have competing representations of the environment, right? One that the marble is in the basket and the other that the marble is in the box. And that then basically in steps through the default network, these representations need to be decoupled from our visual and perceptual systems. So they're basically decoupled from perception and then processed to understand, what is what, which representation refers to what context, and how can I process them, for example, hierarchically to understand, okay, this is actually the representation of the world, the actual world, and this is the representation of someone else's view of the world, or even of several different people. I have to do that in complex social situations, right? And that's where the frontal cortex, then both the IFG and the medial prefrontal cortex may come in.
Okay.
And so we wrote that commentary also because we thought it would be really interesting to be able to study something like that in children and see how actually that time course develops as theory of mind develops. And of course, we can't do that with ECOG, but potentially with a combination of MRI and EEG measures where we have temporal resolution, or also with multivariate EEG analyses.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was going to ask that. So with EEG is obviously nowhere near what ECOG can do, but it can do other things. And you're right, maybe the signal itself can be implied, sort of the inverse problem can be solved if you constrain it in this way with the EEG. And yeah, that's exciting. My initial thought would have been that there's so many iterations, though. It seems like maybe this process happens, but then it seems like it would be a constant iteration of solidifying your sense that it would be hard to disentangle, but it seems like it's clearly disentangled in that regard.
Yeah, I think it is a constant iteration, and it's not like the activation stops in the posterior regions, but it's just more when they come online. And then, of course, there are phases where they go in parallel. So I definitely think that it is an iteration. And it would, of course, be nice to be able to resolve that more in a more fine-grained way. So not just to understand, okay, when do we observe activation, but actually to understand what are these specific regions or even more specific cell groups doing.
And also, if you know the timing, if you could actually precisely measure the timing of this, theoretically, if you really want it. I don't actually like TMS, but you could actually go in at just the right time, sort of disrupt that node of the network to see how it affects behavior. But I don't know if you can get that deep. Maybe there's some deeper structures, maybe more some superficial ones with TMS potentially. But
And then you'd also need like really high temporal resolution, right, to be able to
yeah,
interrupt just in a specific time and then not after. But
right.
yeah, that would be great if we had tools like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. And so then, so along those lines, so you have, 7 Tesla MRI, you have expertise in diffusion imaging at your fingertips. I guess at Nuremberg, you have a group. Do they have a scanner as well? They have other tools. What excites you right now? What are the open questions that you're trying to answer right now as you go forward?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think we kind of talked about some of them already, like to understand better at a finer grained level what the different regions are doing in both social cognition, but also other domains of reasoning that are related to theory of mind. So reasoning about different representations of the world. I think that's actually something really fundamental because as humans, we really do that. We handle all the time different, when we take decisions, for example, we're handling different possibilities that may come out of our decisions, or when we're thinking about the past where we have different trajectories that we could have taken or different things that happen at different times, we have to keep them apart. I think in these different processes, also temporal reasoning and understanding different possibilities. So these regions of the default network actually play an important role also in self-awareness. And so understanding better what these regions are doing in the network on a fine-grained level and really on the mechanistic level, like more, I mean, the idea is if you look at, for example, vision science, we have like all this,
Oh yeah.
like from the columns processing
Yes, I know.
direction and so on. So ideally, we would have an understanding of how this comes about in order to understand other people and reason about different ways of looking at the world and handling those flexibly.
Yeah. So along those lines too. So thinking of vision science and then comparing this, I mean, one of the um, people have commented on this that so in terms of like, for instance, like theory of mind is we all know, we all kind of have an intuitive idea of what that means, and just like working memory or attention or things like that. But do you think is it helpful to maybe try to break that concept down to more elemental mechanistic parts behaviorally, and then sort of probe those? And so maybe that's, it's sort of it's an intuitively graspable thing, but there's probably many sub mechanisms involved in that. Is that maybe something considered or?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that's something that we're working on. I think it's very difficult because it's really complex phenomenon. And of course, we don't know what the right ways of breaking it down. But I think one thing that we're interested in is like breaking down the different elements of that we have to reason about in a specific task, and then try to isolate those, like how those contents are represented in the brain and where and when and how they might be processed and transformed from one region to another. And that definitely needs different paradigms than the ones that we've been using so far. And yeah, that's something that we're working on. And in addition, I think it doesn't only need other paradigms, but also needs other tools. So I think so. One thing that I'm also adding to my research is a computational approach and combining that with multivariate functional methods in order to understand better what's happening there, and also then on a network level
Yes.
to understand how content is being processed.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. All right. So in a computational approach, you mean specifically what? Like multivariate modeling or some sort of
I mean, like as a first starting point, right now we're doing multivariate modeling also, but I mean, ideally, so for example, if you look at memory research, there are very interesting computational models of the hippocampal system, right? And something like that would be very interesting to do for a bigger system,
yeah.
like the default network,
Yes.
like, or starting with the one region, maybe, for example, the temporal junction, to see in more depth what's happening there. Also, an interaction potentially with the hippocampal system. I think that's quite interesting as well.
Yes. I mean, right. All these subcortical structures doing sort of relaying or coordinating the relative act, the connectivity Uh, and it seems that maybe in terms of other tools too. I mean, at Max Planck, you have a 7 Tesla, and some of the earlier work in layer fMRI came from there. I mean, it seems like that might shed some light on input versus output activity, and
Yeah.
who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're also really interested in having some better measures of microstructural changes, like using quantitative MRI measures. So they're at the MPI, there's a neurophysics group led by Nick Weisskopf, and we're collaborating there in order to get a better understanding what's really happening at the microstructural level.
Yeah.
So I think that can add into that puzzle as well. And then at the UTN in Nuremberg, that's University of Technology Nuremberg, there's a lot of AI research. So there I'm collaborating with some colleagues also to understand better how. So that's So that's maybe a little bit of a different topic, but so we're really curious about how infants are learning. And I think social cognition plays a really important role there in guiding their learning. And they're just amazing learners and learn so quickly with very little input compared
Yes.
to, for example, computer vision algorithms. So that's also something that I'm quite excited about, to understand better whether we can learn basically from infant learning for AI.
Oh, that's so cool. That is so cool. And I totally agree. I mean, I think the big problem with AI, I mean, it's right now it's impressive because it's just a brute force sort of algorithm. But our brains, are nowhere near as fast. But this whole one-shot learning thing, I mean, no AI can do that. And it's interesting if there's some deep principles of, if one could come up with a better algorithm that better represents what one-shot learning is. I mean, sort of, there's a lot of context, and maybe it uses context better, or uses some sort of, maybe we're just programmed in a certain way that, yeah, I don't know. It's so interesting. That's a really interesting and important area.
Yeah. And I think actually in infant social, always coming back to social cognition. But for me, that's really like one of the key abilities that seems to distinguish the development of human intelligence, or it seems to, really drive the development of human intelligence. And so in infants, I think learning is also just really strongly driven by social cognition and by social cues that help infants to understand their environment.
Yes.
And so that's something that I'm curious about, whether it's possible to maybe use that kind of information, social information, also in, for example, computer vision or AI, to use social information in order to get a better or a faster representation of complex environments.
Oh,
And
that's
so for example, right now, AI is actually really bad at perspective taking. So I was just for a talk the other day, I was trying to make a slide, trying to generate a picture
yeah.
of a baby looking at a ball and another person looking in the same direction, but a wall being in between. So it just described in that way, the baby can see the ball, but the other person can't. And it took me like 20 prompts, and it's awful. And it just couldn't figure out the perspective. So it was impossible. So in the end, what I had to do was, the wall needs to go to the chin. So I really had to describe it at that kind of level rather than using perspectives.
So that's so interesting. It does seem that maybe related to this, like AI, there is no such thing as like attention in AI. I mean, it's because it just gathers everything and uses everything, and right, if there could be some sort of algorithm for the equivalent of like what attention is, or and better yet, so social attention in this regard, that would be, yeah, that would be interesting. That would be helpful, I think, and that seems like fundamental to uh, once again, going back to sort of consciousness in some sense, fundamental to our sense of selves is sort of this ability to, I mean, it feels like it's linked in that regard to, we have a self, there's others are really important, and taking their perspective is really important. Yeah, that seems like, oh, that's such a rich area. I mean, I love that you're working at least a little bit with groups that do AI development. Yeah, it's tricky though, because back to the mechanism, like what would you do to simulate this or create this in an AI system? And actually thinking carefully about that, I think, is really important. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really challenging also to ask, what would you do in order to isolate what's actually happening, what the infants are actually doing in order to be able to learn from that and to be able to transfer it.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's what we've been discussing. And I think that's a great opportunity that opens up for me now at UTN, because there's this strong focus on AI and computer science.
That's awesome. That's so exciting. That's wide open. Okay, so that's one of the major things that you're doing there. So your career looks like it's a completely rich, brand new sort of open area of research. That's, I think, probably quick advances will be made. So what sort of advice, I always like to end with, other than your directions and what sort of advice would you give sort of a new scientist? I mean, you're relatively young, and for being, so established with 2 groups now and everything, but still, you could probably give advice to young scientists maybe interested in this sort of thing. What do you think are the best approaches, or what things do they need to consider in terms of what was essential for you to do what you've done? I mean, there's a little serendipity, but there's a lot of hard work and good perspectives.
Yeah, I would probably say, just stay curious and really trust your own, follow your own interest, and your own intuitions. So really to not be afraid to think, and also think out of the box, both in terms of the questions, to really follow your own intrinsic interest, and at the same time also in terms of the methods. So I think that's something you talked in the beginning. We talked about me starting in physics, and I feel like one thing that I took along from physics is that I'm not afraid to think of approaching a problem differently than how it has been done before, methodologically. But just to think maybe we could just also look at this in a different way, or approach it with sometimes it's then, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I've made mistakes there, also thinking about something out of the box. And then I realized I didn't consider a certain aspect. But I think not being afraid to do so, and then discussing with colleagues and trying to find out, how can you approach a problem, and how can you think about it in new ways, or think of new methods, and just new ways of approaching a problem or a question. That's really what helped me a lot, and that basically made my way out of. So in physics, I felt a little bit caught, because I just realized I didn't manage to think out of the box. I was just following. And then in neuroscience, I really managed to just go to the library and zoom into a topic I was really curious about, and then all the doors opened up, and all of a sudden I was able to do something that I was really excited about, and I was. People just let me really think about it in my own way. And I'm really grateful for that. And I think maybe that's something that I would recommend to young scientists to do, and to be courageous to take that step.
That's great advice. I do notice a lot more, like you said, we're younger people coming in are sort of they want to plug themselves into a project and just do things. And they're kind of a little bit afraid to step out. And the fact is that even the PIs, they don't, there's so many different modalities, there's so many different theories, there's so many different questions that it's wide open. And I think that there's no right answer, there's no wrong. Just being, like you said, fundamentally trying to be as original and grounded in your own path as possible, I think I agree with you 100%. It's important, and it's obviously served you well. So all right, well I think we'll end with that. But thank you very much for spending the time. I think that this is, a lot of people will find this really, really interesting and really beneficial conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much from my side as well. It was really fun, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
All right. Well, thanks. Yeah, so did I.
Neurosalience is brought to you by the Organisation for Human Brain Mapping. This week's episode is produced by Zhuqian Michelle Lee and Karthik Sama.